There is a soft prison being built all around us. It is not made of bars or iron. It is a lattice of convenience, a fog of constant pleasure, a civilization that mistakes comfort for freedom. Aldous Huxley saw this world before it arrived. He imagined a society so saturated by pleasure that resistance becomes unnecessary. He called it a nightmare of gentle control. Today, his warning is no longer speculative. It is unfolding in the hum of our devices, in the glow of our screens, in the endless, whispering promises of distraction. This video examines how the pursuit of pleasure, when left unchecked, drains our capacity for meaning, weakens our moral resolve, and, paradoxically, creates new forms of bondage. We will trace a path from Huxley's fiction to our present reality, and then into a darker territory, the way pleasure becomes a mechanism of modern slavery. We will ask difficult questions. How does indulgence shape the human soul? At what point does desire become dependence? And how do systems use the modern appetite for pleasure to shape behavior at scale? Huxley believed that a populace lulled by pleasure would be compliant. He imagined soma, a fictional drug that kept people calm and content. In our world, we have no need for a single state-distributed narcotic. We have 1,000 small satisfactions, endless feeds, engineered dopamine hits, micro-entertainments curated to keep attention engaged and curiosity numbed. Each one is harmless on its own. Together, they become the architecture of a society that prefers sedation to struggle. To understand this architecture, we begin by looking at pleasure itself, its biology, its psychology, and its moral effect. Pleasure is not evil. It is a natural response. It drives survival, it bonds families, it rewards achievement. But any human faculty that operates without limits can become a tyrant. Moderation is not merely a prudential good, it is a structural necessity for freedom. When the organs of pleasure are co-opted by external systems, the inner life becomes the site of control. We will proceed in stages. First, the psychology, how modern design hijacks reward systems. Then, the cultural, how a society of ease loses its capacity for thought and endurance. Next, the political and economic, how corporations and institutions profit by turning desire into dependence. Finally, the ethical and practical, what it takes to reclaim autonomy, restore depth, and resist the seduction of the comfortable prison. This is not a moralistic rant. It is an inquiry into how the human soul is shaped by systems and how we might become architects of our own attention again. Chapter 1. The biology of pleasure and the modern hijack. Pleasure begins in the brain as a signal. Dopamine marks anticipation and reward. It evolved to motivate behavior that sustained life, food, mating, social bonding. But that system is blunt. It cannot distinguish between what is life-sustaining and what is cleverly contrived to trigger it. In the modern environment, stimuli are engineered precisely to activate that reward circuitry again and again, without yielding the long-term goods that true flourishing requires. Tech platforms, advertisers, and designers compose symphonies of attention. They fragment experience into micro-rewards, likes, shares, short clips, instant feedback. Each micro-reward is a tiny pulse of pleasure, and the brain learns to seek more pulses with increasing frequency. Over time, the pattern becomes habitual. The person who once practiced patience now prefers immediacy. The person who once read long books now skims headlines. The inner threshold for satisfaction falls, and the hunger for stimulation rises. This is not merely anecdotal. Neuroscience shows that patterned, repeated stimulation alters neural paths. Reward pathways become sensitized. Tolerance develops. Seeking behavior escalates. The consequences touch every domain of life. Attention thins, memory dulls, depth of thought shrinks, and the capacity for sustained effort declines. Where drama and novelty dominate, reflection and endurance have no room to grow. Huxley's insight was to see the political potential of such a biological transformation. If a society can engineer its appetites, it can reduce political friction. People who are persistently entertained are less likely to challenge authority, to endure hardship, or to demand justice. Pleasure functions as a tranquilizer for public courage. In consequence, the highest forms of freedom, freedom of thought, of conscience, of moral action, begin to atrophy. But the hijack goes beyond technologies. Economic systems restructure labor and leisure to maximize consumption. The workday compresses attention into tasks that promote immediate gratification. Marketing reframes identity as a consumable. Even our rituals, meals, social interactions, rest, are subject to commodification. The result is a cultural ecology in which pleasure becomes the primary currency and meaning becomes optional. The biological and cultural forces together create vulnerability. Pleasure ceases to be an occasional reward and becomes the grid on which life is lived. And in that grid, dependency is the endpoint. Addiction is not just a clinical diagnosis, it is a metaphor for a society that measures success by how much gratification it can provide at the shortest delay. Chapter 2. The Cultural Consequences, Soft Minds and Weak Virtues. When gratification is prioritized, disciplines erode. Societies that prize comfort over challenge produce citizens who are less tolerant of complexity. Patience becomes a lost art. The habits that shape character, delayed gratification, sacrifice, hard work, are replaced by instant reward loops. Huxley imagined citizens tranquilized not by brute force, but by the loss of the desire to think critically. This loss does not manifest as stupidity in the crude sense. Rather, it appears as shallowness, a capacity to process information quickly but without depth, a tendency to prefer comforting narratives over uncomfortable truths. Virtue, traditionally understood, requires practice. Courage is developed by exposure to fear. Temperance is learned by resisting desire. Fortitude grows through endurance, but when systems make resistance unnecessary, virtue atrophies. What remains is a moral softness that is easily shaped by slogans, by marketing, and by the loudest voices on a platform. Huxley's citizens accepted control because they preferred pleasure to engagement. The same dynamic is visible in our cultural appetite for spectacle and outrage. Emotional intensity substitutes for moral deliberation. There is also a civic dimension. A polity requires citizens who can think about long horizons, resist immediate pleasures for collective goods, and act sacrificially when necessary. When a population becomes consumed by private pleasure, public life suffers. Democracies require engaged citizens. When attention is monetized and privatized, the shared spaces of deliberation shrink. The public square becomes a market for sensationalism rather than a forum for reasoned debate. Huxley's world warns that the loss of the interior life is the loss of political agency. Someone who cannot tolerate discomfort will avoid political struggle. Someone who seeks constant pleasure will opt out of the labor long necessary for robust institutions. As citizens surrender their attention to curated pleasures, the scaffolding of democratic life erodes. The selective attention economy rewires civic will. And the erosion of virtue is not limited to politics. Intimate life phrase. Relationships become transactional. Pleasure becomes a substitute for care. When one partner seeks constant stimulation outside the relationship, the bond weakens. When individuals avoid pain at all costs, they avoid growth at all costs. The subtle tyranny of comfort rewrites what humans consider a worthy life. Chapter 3. Pleasure as a mechanism of modern slavery. Modern slavery relies on dependency. Huxley's dystopia relied on the populace's goodwill towards sedation. Contemporary slavery adapts that logic to the market. When companies design products and systems that create dependence, they are not merely selling. They are shaping behavior that can become exploitative. The difference between addiction and exploitation is intention and structure. When a system profits by keeping people dependent and distracted, it becomes complicit in coercion. Consider the supply chains that keep consumer goods cheap. The economic model demands relentless efficiency and minimal cost. To meet those demands, labor is outsourced to places where rights are weak and oversight is poor. Workers endure conditions that would be unacceptable in the marketplace where profit is transparent. When consumers prefer low prices and quick delivery to ethical sourcing, the systems that supply those preferences expand, often on the backs of vulnerable laborers. Another vector is the attention economy itself. Platforms monetize attention by shaping behavior. Engagement metrics determine what is visible and what succeeds. The algorithms reward the content that most effectively captures attention, often the sensational, the divisive, the emotionally charged. Content creators compete for a finite market of attention, and many resort to tactics that exaggerate, polarize, or sensationalize. The result is a media environment where truth is adjacent to entertainment and where coherent civic dialogue becomes difficult. Economic coercion and attention coercion intersect. A worker exhausted by the demands of a gig economy consumes quick pleasures during moments of brief respite. That same worker, deprived of long stretches of time for reflection, becomes easier to direct, harder to organize, and less likely to demand systemic reforms. Pleasure becomes both a tool of distraction and a method of labor control. The sedated populace consumes and produces on industrial rhythms set by those who control platforms and markets. There is also a moral dimension. When pleasure cultures prioritize the avoidance of discomfort, moral imagination atrophies. Empathy requires the capacity to sit with another's pain. Pleasure cultures inoculate people against prolonged exposure to suffering. The ease of scrolling past images of distress numbs moral sensibility. The empathy deficit makes it easier for exploitation to persist. Suffering that is out of sight remains out of mind, and thus out of policy. To call this modern slavery is to highlight the subtlety. External compulsion is augmented by internal submission. People choose pleasures that align with available structures. Those structures in turn profit and harden. The result is a self-perpetuating cycle where autonomy is diminished even as apparent choice proliferates. Chapter 4. Reclaiming depth. Discipline, meaning, and ethical consumption. Resistance begins with attention. To reclaim autonomy, the individual must develop a practice of careful, deliberate focus. This may include digital fasting, setting boundaries with devices, and cultivating solitude. Solitude restores the capacity for reflecting on deeper goods. It is in the silent moments that the long view returns, and with it the ability to choose well. Discipline is not punishment, it is training for freedom. When a person learns to delay gratification, to work without immediate reward, and to accept temporary discomfort for longer-term flourishing, the pleasure system recalibrates. Building habits of study, contemplation, and sustained work strengthens the neural systems of self-control. Over time, the person experiences more lasting satisfactions, mastery, friendship, purpose, and creative achievement. Meaning requires engagement with reality. It is found not in endless consumption, but in projects that demand commitment. Raising children, creating art, building institutions, caring for the vulnerable. These activities are often painful and humbling, yet they yield deep fulfillment. A life of meaning is incompatible with a constant appetite for amusement. To choose meaning is to accept that some pleasures must be delayed or declined for higher goods. There is also a political task, shaping institutions that do not profit from exploitation. This requires consumer awareness, regulatory frameworks that hold companies accountable, and public pressure for transparent supply chains. Ethical consumption alone is not enough, but it is part of a broader civic movement. Citizens can demand that technologies be designed for human flourishing, not merely for attention capture. They can insist on labor protections that make cheap goods not a pretext for human suffering. Finally, there is a moral cultivation to practice generosity, to train empathy, to commit to truth. Societies that cultivate communal practices of restraint, rituals, education and character, civic service, repair the erosions of a pleasure-saturated culture. Huxley imagined a populace too pacified to resist. The antidote is a culture that honors endurance, celebrates sacrifice for the common good, and places long-term flourishing above transient delight. Conclusion: Aldous Huxley's warning is not merely literary, it is a diagnosis. The pursuit of pleasure, left untended, can erode the virtues that make freedom possible. When pleasure becomes cheap and ubiquitous, it steals time, attention, and courage. It helps create systems that profit from dependence, and those systems can become forms of modern slavery. But the story does not end in despair. The same human faculties that seek ease also seek meaning. Reclaiming a life of depth requires courage, discipline, and public imagination. It requires small acts, turning off a phone, reading a book, helping a neighbor, that together change the rhythm of a life. It requires political insistence that markets serve human ends. And above all, it requires the inner resolve to choose the demanding goods of a meaningful life over the endless comforts of sedation. Huxley's vision is a caution. It is also an invitation. To refuse the gentle prison is to affirm that pleasure should serve life, not replace it. It is to choose a freedom that feels heavier at times, but is truer and more enduring than any comfort that must be constantly purchased. The question for each listener is simple and unavoidable. What patterns of pleasure in your life have started to rule you? And what will you do to reclaim your attention, your time, and your capacity to flourish?